Well, good evening, everyone. My name is Aanchal Mogla. I use she, her pronouns, and as Arjun mentioned, I'm a manager of policy and legislation with the Ministry of Emergency Management and Climate Readiness. Can you folks hear me in the back? Okay. Yep. I should say I spent most of my weekend gardening, so I inhaled a lot of dirt. So if you hear me coughing, I'm not sick. I'm just getting the dirt out of my throat, I think. Before we begin, just want to acknowledge that we are on the unceded ancestral territories of the Secwepemc people. And I'd like to thank Arjun for inviting me to be here today. As a resident of this city, just really grateful to all the people like yourselves who show up and participate in making this city as great as it is. So today I'll start with an overview of how the province got to a new Emergency and Management Act, also known as EDMA. I'll highlight the parts of the legislation that may be of the most interest to all of you, and then I'll finish up with a quick overview of how you can prepare yourself for emergencies, including where you can find information to get prepared. Go to the next slide, please. Thanks. So as Arjun mentioned, in 2019, BC started developing a new provincial emergency management legislation. And that was really to reflect the changing world by incorporating best practices, learnings from recent events, and the province's commitment to reconciliation. This work has included significant collaborative development with First Nations governments and partners, as well as with local authorities, including regular conversations with folks like the UBCM, Flood and Wildfire Advisory Committee, which Arjun mentioned he was a part of. And he co-chaired, I believe, during your time there. Yeah. So EDMA became law on November 8th, which means that the new act is now in force, and it replaces the Emergency Program Act, or the EPA. The full text of the law is available online if you're interested. The ministry, let's just go back actually, one more. So the ministry recently concluded public engagement for two key areas of supporting regulations. One are regulations for local authorities governing how they're able to use certain tools under the Act, and the other is for post-emergency financial assistance, which some of you may know as disaster financial assistance. And that's a funding program that's available in certain emergencies to replace uninsurable essential losses. These aren't the only regulations that are being developed to support the new law, but they are of high interest to people and communities around the province, so just flagging those two for you. EDMA introduces new concepts and changes, and so we're taking a phased approach to implementation. And if you're interested in what's coming into force right now and what still needs to come into force through regulation, you can find some resources on the EMCR ministry website underneath the Modernized Emergency Management Legislation page. We can go to the next one. So the next couple of slides provide an overview of some of the key changes that are now in effect. It's not a comprehensive list, but it will give you sort of a general understanding of what changes are coming. Before we dive in, it's important to recognize that EDMA recognizes the inherent right of self-government of First Nations. As such, many of the new key components require local authorities and other emergency management partners to consult and cooperate with Indigenous governing bodies. So as Arjun mentioned, there are 4 pillars of emergency management that are now recognized under the Act, and that's really intending for us to take a proactive approach when it comes to emergency management. So it's mitigation, preparedness, response, and recovery. This holistic approach aligns with the United Nations Sendai Framework for Disaster Risk and Reduction, and the province adopted that in 2018, apologies. The Sendai Framework speaks to an all-of-society approach, which was built into EDMA in several ways. There are now planning requirements for the vast majority of critical infrastructure owners and the array of actors that come together during an emergency. And those requirements include considering how people, places, and animals are affected by emergencies and disasters differently and disproportionately. There's a new definition of emergency in the Act as well, and that allows for the declaration of emergencies in different circumstances. So for example, the old Act did not consider acts or deliberate human acts, so things like terrorism or rioting, as emergencies, and the new Act now does. There's also a new threshold for when an emergency is present, and that's been changed to better reflect cultural values. So for an example, when a wildfire or a flood could threaten or destroy a significant First Nations cultural site that's within a local authority's jurisdiction, the local authority can declare a state of local emergency to protect that cultural site. For emergencies in your city's jurisdiction, under the previous law, local authorities, like the city of Kamloops, can manage emergencies within their own jurisdictional boundaries. In addition to that now, your city or local authority can also declare a state of local emergency and use certain emergency powers, and they can manage temporary access to areas that are under evacuation orders. For a local authority to issue an evacuation order, it must first declare a state of local emergency. And if a local authority is considering issuing evacuation alerts or orders for areas that are within their jurisdiction, they must first consult and coordinate with any adjacent local authorities, and they must consult and cooperate with Indigenous governing bodies. There was no change from the EPA when it comes to how the scope of evacuation orders can be set. So local authorities have flexibility under the new law to control the scope of evacuation orders. That means when an evacuation order is made, it can be written to allow certain people, like first responders or police, to come in to protect critical infrastructure or to remain in the evacuated area for whatever the purpose is that the government has decided they need to be there. And by government, referring to your local government. And so really, it's up to the authority that is issuing the evacuation order to determine who gets to be within the evacuation order, who has to stay, who has to leave, who can come in for what purposes. It's all within their call to be making. And so for certainty, local authorities can issue evacuation orders to provide for things like temporary re-entry using access permits. The local authority can issue those access permits to people who, in their opinion, have a valid reason to be entering the evacuation order zone, whether temporarily or permanently. There's also work being done on compliance and enforcement. And so when an evacuation order is put into place, whether that's by the province or by your local authority, it is binding. And so that means if you're told to evacuate, it's time for you to head to safety, whether you feel you want to or not. The government's preference when it comes to compliance and enforcement is to use education, awareness, and other soft approaches. But just like the former law did, EDMA now includes a maximum monetary penalty and a maximum 1-year term of imprisonment for offenses committed under the Act. The $100,000 fine is an increase from the EPA's $10,000 fine, and that really reflects the fact that the old law was drafted over 30 years ago. The $100,000 maximum reflects sort of the standard of fine amounts that are across the province and across the country. So there was really no change to the maximum imprisonment term when we moved from the old law to the new law. And again, that imprisonment term is common across various pieces of law across the province, which have nothing to do with emergencies or people's rights or freedoms. And I do want to stress that the province does not routinely use the maximum penalty. It exists for certainty, and it's just there to be a sort of a best practice and awareness tool for everyone. That includes the government, the citizens, and the courts, to know what those maximum consequences are for offenses rather than leaving it open for prosecutors and the courts to decide. Oh, right. Go to the next slide, please. Awesome. So on the topic of getting prepared for emergencies, something that many of us here I'm sure are very familiar with, the province has a number of resources that are available to support preparing for and responding to an emergency. So there's Prepared BC, which is the province's emergency preparedness education program. It serves the general public, local governments, Indigenous communities, as well as schools. They provide information on how people can prepare or recover from emergencies, and they can also include guides on knowing the hazards in your area that you need to plan for. So I took a little screenshot of what the TNRD hazards to be aware of are, and they're wildfires, floods, landslides, and severe weather. And it can also give you tips on how to prepare for emergencies, so what you should have in your emergency kits and what sort of plan you need for yourself and your family, whether that's knowing an evacuation route that you all plan on taking, have a city or a family house in another location that you plan on meeting up at should you be separated. So there's a whole bunch of tools on there, and I would encourage everybody to follow Prepared BC on whatever social media platform you subscribe to. So they're on Instagram, X, formerly Twitter, and they're also on Facebook. Go to the next slide, please. And there's another resource called Emergency Info BC, and this one provides current and official information during emergencies in BC. So you can either follow them on X, or you can go to their info and get live, up-to-date information on what's going on across the province. Go to the next slide. Awesome. So if you're under an evacuation alert or order, depending on the severity of the situation, one or the other might be issued. So it's important to understand the difference and to always follow the advice and direction of your local authorities. So an evacuation alert puts you on notice that you should be ready to leave on short notice or no notice. If you receive an evacuation alert, you should gather all of your essential belongings, which includes important documents like your government-issued ID, any insurance paperwork, mortgage or tenancy applications, things that could prove your residency to a certain location. And then if you require support services in an emergency, you can pre-register online at ess.gov.bc.ca. And that's a tool that really will help you speed up processes if you find yourself being evacuated and needing to go to a reception center. They can log you in. They can get you in touch with family members if you're not sure where they are, and those people have logged in. And they can even get you set up with certain supports if you're in need of them. So things like accommodations, food vouchers, travel vouchers, stuff like that. An evacuation order, on the other hand, is issued when your local authority requires you to leave the area immediately. And that's because they believe there's a threat to your life or safety. Evacuation orders will include where you can travel to for support, such as an emergency reception center, and the travel route that you should follow. If you have insurance or people that you can stay with, the preference and recommendation is always to go to those people first and to sort of save the services that are at those emergency reception centers for folks who might not have access to other places. And then if you require transportation services, please ask the person or let the person know, the person who's coming to your door to let you know of the evacuation order, let them know that you need transportation services, and they'll be able to arrange that for you. And then when the emergency is passed, you'll be notified of when it's safe to return to your area. So the next slide. So that is the end of my presentation. I will note that this QR code will take you to our modernized emergency management webpage, which is information and educational resources on all things emergency management, and it'll also link you to those other pages that I'd mentioned, such as Prepare BC and the ESS registration page. If you want, you can email any questions that you have to the modernized EM inbox. That email address is monitored all the time, and we'll get the questions sent to the person on our team that it goes to. And then just as way of conclusion, I did mention that there was 2 regulations that we were doing public engagement on to the local authorities as well as post-emergency financial assistance. The formal discussion or formal engagement period for that has ended, and we're going to be releasing a What We Heard report in the spring. But if you do have questions or want to provide any further information, you can always submit it to that email address as well. We will review the information and consider it. It might not just make it into a publicly released report. And with that, I will end it there.
What other changes are being considered? You said you're phasing them in.
Yeah, so there are going to be requirements on local authorities into the future on risk assessments and plans, and so really be telling the local authorities how they can do these risk assessments, what needs to go in them, who they need to consult with. There will be processes on what that consultation looks like with Indigenous partners. There will be regulations coming in about compliance and enforcement as well. Things related to who critical infrastructure owners are and what critical infrastructure means. So there's a whole bunch of other changes that will be coming in.
I just changed. So what I was hoping to do was have Mike speak and then
Okay.
No, I didn't say it, so that's not your fault. It's my fault. But I was hoping to get a couple of presentations and more conversation after that. That work for everybody? We have anything burning? Carlos, is burning?
Of course. Fire.